The new Rover 800, completely redesigned with more style and more presence than ever before. Engineered to provide exceptional levels of performance and efficiency. Thoroughly tested to ensure the desired levels of quality and reliability are surpassed. A car truly worthy of the Rover mark.
Hello, my name's Bob Townsend. This programme's designed to introduce the new Rover 800 series to you, the service technician, and perhaps more importantly we'll be covering the new technical features and basic service procedures. The entire model range will consist of 4 engine derivatives. We'll have a 2 litre, a 2 litre turbo, a 2.7 litre V6 and a 2.5 litre turbocharged diesel. From initial launch though, there'll be just 2 engines. Firstly, the 2.7 litre V6, 24 valves, PGM-FI sequential fuel injection. As you can see, it's basically a carryover from 91 model year. What I will say though is that as with all the petrol derivatives of the new 800 range, it's equipped with a full 3-way closed-loop catalyst system. That affects you in the way you service the cars, in as much that there's no mixture adjustment on these vehicles. The only basic tuning operation is setting up of the EICV valve, so that's the idle control valve. The way that's done, looking at the yellow flashing LED under the seat on the PGM-FI ECU, is exactly the same as 91 model year. Talking of flashing LEDs, it still has, as from 91 model year, the red LED, which basically gives fault codes should anything go wrong with the fuel injection system. That also applies, there's 2 fault codes for each oxygen sensor. Now, people have been caught out in the past. What they've been doing, as soon as they've seen the ECU fault code for an oxygen sensor, is change the oxygen sensor. That's not the thing you want to do, because that fault code could quite easily be a wiring fault from the ECU to the oxygen sensor, or even a fueling problem. Anyway, to sum up, the 2.7 litre is basically a carryover engine unit. Now, carryover is certainly not a term you could use to describe the new 2 litre T-Series engine. Okay, straight away you can see it is a development of the old M16 unit, but it's made up of mostly new components. In fact, over 90% of the components that go to make up this engine, the T-Series, are entirely new. Much more than just plastic cam covers screwed onto an existing engine. The head casting, for instance, is entirely new. Basically what's happened is that the whole thing has been opened up. The oil drain passages within the head have been opened up, and this has also led to a raised platform on the head. That increases the structural rigidity of the head, also an improvement. The idea behind this increasing of the passages is to facilitate fully internal closed-circuit breathing, as we saw on K-Series. So we have an example of a successful design feature from one engine benefiting the new Rover 800 via the internal breathing system. Okay, and the cylinder block is different for basically the same reason. The size of those internal breather passages have been opened up to allow not only oil drain back from the head into the sump, but also crankcase breather gases to pass up through the cylinder block into the head and into the inlet system. So why do we have internal breathing? What's its bonus? Basically, we lose a lot of unsightly pipe work. making the new T-Series engine a lot tidier, a lot neater installation. There are in fact only two external breather hoses. We've got a small one here from the inlet cam cover to the throttle body, and a smaller one still, again from the inlet cam cover, but this time to the inlet manifold. Now, this brass boss in the inlet manifold has a small restrictor in it. So obviously if you get any problems with this breather system, look there first. Now, improving the refinement was a firm design brief for the T-Series engine, and one of the ways that was achieved was to improve the balance of the crankshaft. We've in fact now doubled the number of crankshaft counterbalance weights, again improving that rotational balance, leading to greater refinement, as does the new lightweight pistons, only 2 valve cutouts now. Now that basically covers our brief under bonnet look at the T-Series engine. Now I want to take a look at the fuel system. It's a MEMS system, so Modular Engine Management System. Multi-point injection, so an injector for each cylinder. Now I said this was a new system. It is in fact very similar to that you saw on the 220 GTI. If we just go over briefly the component location, we've got the stepper motor and the throttle potentiometer both here on the throttle body. Plastic fuel rail, which is unusual, here underneath the inlet manifold, with a fuel rail temperature sensor feeding signals to an ECU here on the bulkhead. That's a combined ECU, so it's controlling the ignition and fueling requirements of the engine. Now, as I said earlier, all petrol derivatives of the new Rover 800 range have full three-way closed-loop catalyst systems. So here we have the oxygen sensor feeding signals to the MEMS ECU. In turn, the MEMS ECU is controlling fueling, feeding the exact composition of exhaust gases to that three-way catalyst in the exhaust pipe. Tuning, again, is pretty similar to Rover 220 GTI, except for a new Microcheck card. That's a version 3 card, really the only card you should be using on the Rover 800 models. The way in which it goes through the tuning sequence is pretty similar, but one point I should have mentioned is that the serial port that Microcheck connects into has moved away from the ECU. They're usually very close to the ECU, but it's moved away now on the right-hand suspension turret. But as I say, the way it goes through that tuning routine is exactly the same. A point I should mention is that some people got caught out in the change in philosophy of the way that Microcheck goes through the tuning procedure. When, as with 220, when it asks you to set the stepper motor, it's asking you to do exactly that, to set stepper motor steps, not engine speed. Now, when you set the stepper motor, the system remains live, it remains active. So what you're in fact doing by adjusting that air bypass is change the number of stepper steps that need to be applied to maintain the programmed idle speed. That's what it's looking for. Incidentally, the stepper steps are displayed in the top right-hand side of the Microcheck screen, and you've got a simple display which tells you to increase or decrease those steps. So it's really quite simple, but a change in philosophy, as I said. Now, again, something that's been catching people out is basically swapping ECUs. These ECUs have adaptive idle control, so it's important to note that if you swap ECUs between vehicles, they will have picked up the characteristics of the vehicle to which it was last fitted. So obviously swapping them between vehicles will cause idle speed problems. The way to get around it, the only sure way to get around it, is whenever you fit an ECU, carry out a full Microcheck tune sequence. This system, the MEMS system on the new Rover 800, is dubbed LTI. And what does LTI stand for? Well, basically it's long tracked inlet. In broad terms, if you increase the length of the inlet manifold tracks, make them long and thin, it tends to push peak torque down in the rev range. So by definition, 16 valve twin cam engines tend to be very peaky. So what this LTI manifold does is push the peak torque of the engine down into a more usable range, a range more useful to the average driver. Okay, that's a brief overview of the engine features and the fuel system. Now let's take a look at the engine out on a bench as I promised.
The T-Series engine employs internal engine breathing. The crankshaft has 8 counterbalance weights. LTI is used to maximize engine performance at a more usable rev range. MEMS is used to control both fuel and ignition systems, and a 3-way closed-loop catalyst system is fitted as standard.
Now, as promised, a deeper look at some more of the T-Series features and basic service procedures. First off, you can see the internal crankcase breathing has led to a much neater engine, particularly round the back. You've lost a lot of pipe work, the oil vapour separator, everything has all gone. Now, one important refinement was to the rear main sealing, so that's a crankshaft rear main sealing. Instead of the 2-phased operation you had on M16, you've now got a single rear main seal carrier. A rubber ring seals the carrier to the block, and the seal itself is actually bonded within this housing. It's secured to the block with 5 fixings and a couple of dowels. Obviously, that being a plastic composite, you want to be careful of that tightening procedure. Check that out in the repair manual. Another very interesting feature is the combined power steering pump and water pump. Now, combined probably isn't the right term because the functions of each pump are still separate, but they're combined in as much as they're driven along the same axis. The water pump picking up drive from a drive dog at the back of the power steering pump. Now, the water pump, if I can get it out of the housing, actually consists of 2 components. You have the end cover with obviously the bottom hose connection and the impeller housing. Obviously in there the impeller, the seals, and there's that drive dog I was talking about that picks up drive from the back of the power steering pump. Now, as with a lot of the new features on T-Series, you'll find O-ring seals. There's 3 of them on that impeller housing alone. Now obviously if you're to get any wear in the water pump, it's going to be in that impeller housing. And the reason I say that is because this item here, go that the right way, is actually called up as a water pump housing. Now obviously it contains a passageway, the water outlet from the pump, fed directly into the side of the block, and there's a little O-ring seal again, sealing that to the block. Now obviously there's nothing that can wear in here. All the wear that will take place will be in that impeller housing. So under normal circumstances there's no reason at all to change that assembly. Okay, we're just going to have to turn the engine round to look at some basic service procedures as relates to the new belt arrangement. Firstly, the auxiliary drive belt we talked about drives all the ancillaries on the engine, including that combined power steering pump and water pump. 60,000 mile belt life, 24,000 mile checks. Obviously at those 24,000 mile periods you'll be looking for any splits, frays, cracks in that belt. Fully automatic tensioning, so similar to that you saw on VM diesel, and I reckon it's pretty easy to change. Obviously there's not a lot of room in between the engine and the front side member here, but having said that, with the engine jacked up and usually a normal ring spanner you shouldn't have any problems. You certainly wouldn't get a socket like that on it though. Okay, on the centre nut, take the tension away, whip the belt off, and I don't reckon anything could be easier than that. Okay, now onto timing belt. The timing belt's changed. I think most of you think it's for the better. Most of the changes as a result of this remote water pump drive by the auxiliary belt. There's actually 10 screws securing the upper and lower covers. I've cheated and removed 8 of them. Okay, just get the lower cover out of the way. As you can see, a lot simpler belt run. We've lost the water pump out of the frame, so that's led to obviously a much simpler belt run. Now, we talked earlier about the internal breathing being a carryover from K-Series engine. Well, here's an example of another feature, design feature of K-Series engine being carried over onto T-Series to benefit the new Rover 800 range. And that's 96,000 mile belt life with semi-automatic tensioning. So as with K-Series, Like you say, we've got a 96,000 mile belt life, so 8 years on average that's going to last. And semi-automatic tensioning, 48,000 miles you'll be checking the belt for any splits, cracks, any teeth starting to lift. But apart from that, no reason to touch the belt at all. Now what I'll do now is show you how to remove and refit that belt. It is a slightly different procedure to K-Series. And I'll do the procedure as if we had, say, a cylinder head problem, or we had one of these camshaft seals weeping that hadn't contaminated the belt. As with all belts, if they're contaminated with oil or coolant, they should be changed. Now, one thing that confused me, particularly if you've worked on K-Series engines before, you might get caught out as well, is that that timing mark there is not a safe mark. That isn't a belt timing mark as it is on K-Series. It's in fact a top dead centre mark. If you try to time the belt up with that mark, you'll be in trouble. Okay, but we've got a timing pin that fits into the flywheel. That's a carryover M16 feature to enable us to set the engine 90 degrees before top dead centre on the compression stroke of number 1 cylinder. So we wind the engine round until the inlet mark on the inlet camshaft, the exhaust mark on the exhaust camshaft line up, and at that stage the pin should drop in. Okay, there we are. Now the crankshaft's locked in that 90 degrees before TDC position. Now with the engine locked up, we then fit the camshaft locking tool. That's a carryover from M16. And once I've fitted that, I'll tell you a little bit about the special tools on T-Series engine. And basically most of the special tools are in fact a complete carryover from M16. There are in fact only 2 new special tools. Firstly, we talked about that raised platform on top of the cylinder head there. That's obviously negated the use of the old lifting bracket, the old engine lifting bracket, because it won't sit on the head properly anymore. So there's a new lifting bracket you'll need for that. And also, as a result of the new power steering pump, you've got a new tool, a new adapter for your pressure gauge when you're testing those power steering pressures. Most of them carry over. Now you must fit that camshaft locking tool before you remove the belt, because the T-Series, as with the M16, is unsafe. I always think that's a pretty drastic term to use, but what that means basically is if you lose the relationship between crankshaft and camshaft drive, the pistons will hit the valves, obviously leading to a pretty expensive engine rebuild. So make sure whenever you're going to take the belt off that that's fitted and the crankshaft locking tool is in and those pistons are in their safe position halfway down the bores. As with K-Series, you've got the semi-automatic tensioner, only a single bolt in this one though, so it's easier if anything than K-Series. Loosen the centre bolt, push the bracket fully round, nip it up again, and now all that tension's off the belt and we should be able to ease the belt, and it is ease as well. As with all timing belts, we should never pry the belt with anything like a screwdriver or you'll damage the fibres inside the belt, and it certainly wouldn't last 96,000 miles. So just easing the belt off. It is tempting, it's quite difficult actually doing as I'm doing now, so just removing it from the cam gears and not the crank, because with this crankshaft pulley on, we've got the lower cover on, it means we can't pull the belt off the tensioner jockey pulley. Having said that, it does come off fairly easily. And there we are, the belt's off. We can carry out any work on the top end. Normal, good practice as regards the belt, obviously don't bend to acute angles or you'll break some of the strands in the belt. No contamination, make sure it stays nice and clean. Okay, we've got the belt off. To refit it, very similar arrangement. Pull the belt up nice and firmly, make sure it's on that crankshaft gear. Around the exhaust cam. Wasn't quite pulled up on that crankshaft gear enough. There we go. And there's the belt back on. With the belt on, we can loosen off the jockey pulley, and that springs up to take up some of the belt slack. Now I say some of the belt slack because obviously there's no way this small tensioner spring will be able to pull slack away from this side of the belt. So as with K-Series, what we have to do is physically push by rotating the engine, all the belt slack around to the slack side of the belt to be taken up by the tensioner pulley. Obviously first remove the camshaft locking tool and the crank pin and rotate the engine 2 full turns clockwise, finishing up at the timed position. No real need to put the timing pin in again, it's only a rough estimate. Now that obviously pushes that slack around. We torque tighten the jockey pulley, not just nip it up as I'm doing there. And finally we remove the timing pin. And that's it, the basic features and service procedures on the T-Series engine. Now let's get back to the cars.
The T-Series features a composite rear main oil seal. The water pump is mounted onto the rear of the pass pump. The auxiliary drive belt is tensioned automatically, while a semi-automatic tensioner is used to control timing belt tension as K-Series. And remember, always use the timing pin and locking tool when removing and refitting the timing belt.
Now let's take a brief look at suspension, steering and brakes. The reason I say a brief look is because those items are basically a carryover from 91 model year. There are a couple of important differences there I'd like to go through briefly. Firstly, in terms of the front suspension, all models get a new thick 23mm anti-roll bar. Steering systems, apart from that combined power steering pump and water pump we saw with the engine out on a bench, steering systems again are a carryover from 91 model year, with a positive centre field system, power steering system for the 2-litre cars, and a speed proportional system for V6. That's again carryover. Braking systems, all models except for the baseline 820i get the Bosch ABS 2E anti-lock braking system. Essentially the same system you saw before, but with a couple of important enhancements. Firstly, the ABS ECU carries out static checks to each wheel sensor as the ignition's turned on. So in addition to the dynamic checks that are still carried out, you've got static checks of the integrity of the wiring to each sensor. That in turn has given us 4 additional ECU fault codes. The way those fault codes are initiated by bridging wires underneath the steering column to make the dashboard warning light flash are exactly the same. A list of those new fault codes is contained within the electrical fault finding manual. Staying with brakes for a minute, the inboard pads of all 4 wheels now have an audible pad wear sensor. Now obviously when the pads reach their minimum thickness, this steel tang starts contacting the disc, will start singing, alerting the driver that he needs his pads changing. That incidentally is the same system as used on Rover 200 and 400 models.
All models are fitted with a 23mm front anti-roll bar. Anti-lock braking is a standard feature on all models except the 820i. Static checks to the wheel speed sensors and wiring are carried out by the ABS ECU, which has resulted in 4 additional fault codes. And finally, audible wear sensors are fitted to all 4 inner brake pads.
Now for some of the new Rover 800's electrical features. And perhaps the first thing you'll notice as you pick up, say, the PDI job card and the keys is the new infrared handset. There's 2 buttons. We've got a dimpled one on the right, a red flashing LED for lock, smooth one on the left, green flashing LED for unlock. Nothing difficult there. From this you'll gather that all models in the new Rover 800 range have infrared central door locking. It actually goes deeper than that because they've also got a standard alarm system. This alarm system's new and it has two functions, two levels of protection then. Firstly, you've got parametric protection. Now, parametrics is a rather highbrow way of saying it's protecting all the hinged panels, so that's the doors, the bonnet, tailgate or boot, against forced entry. So if I pretend to break in, the alarm goes off, and again that's no real difference between that system and 91 model year so far. But in addition to the parametrics, as I say, it's got two functions. In addition to parametrics, you've also got ultrasonic protection. Ultrasonics basically looks at the airspace within the car. It looks for any air movement. So if a thief manages to gain entry through, say, a broken window, something like that, then the alarm should go off. It takes about 35 seconds to basically set the system up, for the system to set itself up. It's looking at the airspace, calibrating itself, if you like, so it should go off now anyway. Let's have a go. Away. Now to switch that sounder off, that's in either mode, when it goes off any other time, the sound is incidentally underneath that plenum, underneath the wiper plenum. You switch either of the buttons, so either lock or unlock will switch that sounder off. Now, if I try and lock the car with one of the doors open, it could easily be a bonnet or a tailgate, a boot, the system will tell me that something's open, and you won't arm the alarm system as you won't lock the doors. And incidentally, you know when the system's armed properly, because the interior lights will actually flash twice. Now, okay, we have the interior lights flashing twice. That shows that the alarm's set up. Additionally, if you slam lock the car, the central door locking will work fine, but the alarm won't be armed in either mode, so you won't get ultrasonics or parametric alarm. Now, in 90% of cases, that's probably all the owner will need to know: how to lock and unlock the doors, and as a consequence, how to arm and disarm the alarm. You can, however, arm the parametric side of the alarm whilst keeping ultrasonics switched off, keeping that out of play. I'll show you how to do that. Above the driver's head is a switch, USD ultrasonic disable. Pressing it puts the little red LED out. That's saying that the next time the alarm is armed, you'll only have parametrics, no ultrasonics. Now, to rearm the ultrasonic system, you simply put the key in the barrel and take it out again. There's a little micro switch in there, read by the CCU. Every time it sees that switch being operated, it puts ultrasonic back in the frame. Now, there's one more feature tied in with central door locking and alarms, but I'd like to come back to that in a minute. For a moment, I want to talk about electric windows. The electric window system's new in that it allows one-touch operation of the windows in both up mode and down. That counts for the sunroof too, if it's got fitted with an electric sunroof. Now, I'll cover those features in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about setting the system up. That's something you'll have to do whenever the battery's been disconnected. So if the car's been in a compound, obviously the battery will have been disconnected, you'll have to set those windows up. It's quite easy though. With the ignition on, we have to operate each window and the sunroof from the fully closed position. So keep your finger on the down button, the CCU's bleeping away. Don't take your finger off until that bleeping stops. Now, fully up, CCU again bleeping. There, take your finger off when it stops. Now, all being well, we should have one touch operation. One touch down, and it really is a sharp tap on that button to get the one touch operation in play. Now, one touch down there is no real difference to systems you've seen before on, say, a Montego or a previous Rover 800. What is new, though, is one touch operation to close the windows and the sunroof. Now, if you want the window in any other position than fully open or fully closed, then you can either jump into the one-touch operation by a sharp tap on the other direction of the button, or you can hold your finger on the button till the window reaches its desired position and then take it off. Now, as a byproduct of this one-touch operation in the up mode, you also have a back-off facility. Now, that basically means if the window should hit an obstacle, my hand for instance, in one touch up, it will back off once it meets that obstacle. Now, the same applies to the electric sunroof. As soon as it hits the obstacle, meets that obstacle and backs off. The difference here is that it will only back off around about 4 inches. It is possible, obviously, to override this back-off facility. Now, let's say the owner has got an iced-up runner. He's got a heavily iced runner and he needs to shut that window. In normal operation, as soon as it hits that obstacle, it will shoot back down again. He obviously doesn't want to leave his car open on an icy night, so we allow him to override that facility. How you do it is by pressing both window up switches simultaneously. Keep your fingers on those buttons. Initially, it meets my hand and goes back down. Now we're waiting for a bleep from the CCU, a series of bleeps. I now have 5 seconds to operate that window, and back off is switched off. I'll take my hand away if you don't mind. Okay, so we can override the system. An important point to note is that you can only override this back off facility from the driver's door switch pack. And whenever you've closed that window, so you've carried out that overriding operation, the system is automatically switched back on, so back off facility is back in play. Now, a little earlier on, I'll just open that window, take the keys out, because a little earlier on I talked about a feature that was tied in with central door locking and alarms. That's a feature called lazy locking. What that enables the driver to do, as the name implies, is to not only lock the door and set the alarms using the infrared transmitter, but also to close all the door windows and the electric sunroof from outside the car. Hold the button in lock and you'll actually see the LED flash faster, and each window will close in sequence. Now if I duck out of the sequence halfway through, as I've done there, the alarm will bleep at you to tell you that lazy lock hasn't been carried out successfully. Now, lazy lock won't work unless the windows, each window and the electric sunroof have been set up for one-touch operation. So you must go through that procedure I covered a little bit earlier to set that one-touch operation up on everything on the car. Now also, if any of the hinged panels are open, the doors, bonnet, tailgate or boot, lazy lock also won't work. That inertia switch we saw on the under bonnet view of the 2 litre, as well, if that's tripped, central door locking, lazy locking, alarm also won't work. Now all the features we've seen on central door locking, the alarm setting and indeed lazy locking can quite just as easily be carried out through either the driver's door lock switch or the passenger door lock switch. For lazy locking, simply hold it over in lock. There we are, the driver's door window goes up, and lastly, the sunroof.
The burglar alarm features both parametric and ultrasonic settings. The alarm will not arm if any of the hinged panels are open. Similarly, the alarm will not arm if the vehicle is slam-locked. The ultrasonic setting can be switched off by pressing the USD switch. All electric windows feature one-touch operation, as does the electric sunroof. The windows and sunroof must be reset each time the electrical feed is removed. The back-off facility will operate if the windows or sunroof meet an obstruction. This feature can be overridden from the driver's switch pack. The windows and sunroof must be set for one-touch operation before lazy locking will operate. If lazy locking is aborted before completion, a warning bleep will be heard. Lazy locking can be operated from the key or infrared handset.
Now perhaps the first thing you'll notice as you sit inside the car is the new safety padded steering wheel. The rotary column switches also new, and incidentally those wipers now park on screen as standard. There's no off-screen parking as with 91 model year. Cruise switches also changed. ATC, that's air temperature control, now on all aircon models as with 91 model year. On those models with electric seats, the switch gear's also been changed. Now a lot more ergonomic, a lot easier to get your hands round. Say a rotary design, so we can adjust the squab anywhere we like it, both together, to raise the seat, to lower the seat, whole switch forward, rearward for forward, backwards movement, a separate switch for seat recline, again rotary design. Now the lumbar pad adjustment is pretty much as 91 model year, that's on the passenger seat as well. Seat memory, the driver now has 2 seat memory positions, and remember that allows him to store not only seat positions but also that of his mirrors, so 2 drivers can store their favourite seat and mirror positions. To call them back, simply hold your finger on, it will bleep at you when it's finished. Some more switch gear changes. Firstly, the instrument pack illumination is now a rocker type switch. That's important to you because that's the way in which you initialise CCU self-test. Some models now have an analogue clock. This top of the range Sterling has a Clarion radio cassette with CD auto changer. The auto changer is actually in the boot. You can store 6 CDs in there, call up each track in order through the radio set. The first thing you'll need to know about this new radio cassette system is how to code it, perhaps at PDI. Simplicity itself, turn the radio on, press one of the large buttons on the top row. Again, it'll now ask for the code. Tap the code in using the preset buttons 4, 1, 5, 1. When the code's in successfully, press auto store and the radio springs to life. So nothing difficult about that. Now to round up, let's take a quick look in the boot. Here's the CD auto changer. As I say, there's a cassette in there, facility to store 6 discs. Call any of those tracks up in order through the radio set. Now anyone who's worked on the old torsion boot assist springs you had on the old Rover 800 will appreciate the change to a much simpler tension spring design. As I say, a lot simpler to adjust the tension on that. The radio aerial amplifier has now moved from underneath the parcel shelf. It hasn't gone far though. It's now on top beneath this trim panel. The amplifier is a bit unusual. It now has 2 aerial connections. Now you're looking for the white one, colour-coded sticker there, so connect it to the white one. If that sticker should fall off, it's the AM/FM connector you're after. Now the existing in-car entertainment fast check can be used to check all the radios in the new Rover 800 range. That's the Philips, which is basically a carryover from 91 model year, and the Clarion system. It can't though test the coax between the new amplifier and the radio set, but all isn't lost because there is no longer any capacitor in that line, so you can check it out using the standard digital multimeter. Just one more point before I leave. 60/40 split rear seats now right across the range, that's on saloons and fastbacks. 2 little levers either side of the rear seat.
The wiper blades park on screen only. The CCU's self-test facility can be initialized through the instrument dimmer switch. The coaxial lead must be fitted to the amplifier connection identified by the white sticker. Use a digital multimeter to test the coaxial lead.
That just about ties up our technical reveal to the new Rover 800 series. I hope you found the programme interesting. and above all, informative.
And now to the prizes being offered for this program, the Rover 800 Technical Reveal. You'll find enclosed with this video package a multiple choice quiz offering you the opportunity to win one of 6 torque wrenches and a chance to increase your total number of accredited technician points. The closing date completed answer sheets should be in by is the 1st of February 1992. And good luck.